Good morning. Hi, I'm Frank Messina, Chairman of the Chatham Historical Commission, and I'd like to welcome to a special meeting. This is the South Chatham Village Historic District Informational Meeting, a requirement of the process in order to hopefully affect the listing of the South Chatham Village as a National Register District. I have a couple of announcements I have to make quickly. This meeting is being recorded and will be shortly available hereafter for scheduled and on-demanding viewing on any smartphone or tablet device. If anyone else is recording the meeting, please notify the chairman. Thank you. Pursuant to Governor Baker's June 6, 2021 signing of an act relative to extending certain provisions of the COVID-19 measures adopted during the state of emergency, including the extension of his March 12, 2020 order suspending provisions of that open meeting law, General Law 30A-20, until July 15, 2022. This meeting of the Chatham Historical Commission is being conducted both in person and via remote participation. Every effort will be made to ensure the public can adequately address the proceedings as provided in the order. A reminder that persons who would like to listen to this meeting while it is in progress may do so by calling the phone number 508-945-4410, conference ID 419-566-018 #, or by joining the meeting online via Microsoft Teams through the link in the posted agenda. Despite our best efforts, we might not be able to provide for real-time access. We will post a record of this meeting on the town's website as soon as possible. That was long. In addition, this meeting obviously is being recorded in addition to live publication. So we'd like to thank everyone, including the town of Chatham, for allowing us process in this meeting to go forward. As I indicated, this is an informational meeting that's required as part of the process. And I'd like to first, before we begin, and welcome you and introduce a few people. There's some members of the Historical Commission present, Bob Lear, the Vice Chair, and Jane Moffett, a member of the Commission. There are a number of other people calling in addition to those present, okay? I'd like to quickly introduce a couple of people. First, Ben Haley, National Register Director, Massachusetts Historical Commission. Ben is online, and you should be able to see his photograph there. In addition, we have Eric Dre, our preservation consultant to the Historical Commission, and he will be giving an explanation of the South Chatham Village nomination. And Sarah Korjeff, to my left, who's a preservation specialist of the Cape Cod Commission, and Sarah will give an overview of the Cape Cod Commission involvement in the National Register District. We'll then take questions from the residents and from the public, and that's about it. So at this particular time, if there's no other questions, I'll turn the meeting over to Ben.
Okay, thanks, Frank. Let me just share my screen. All right. So can you all see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. So as Frank said, I'm going to just give an overview about the National Register program generally. And as he said, after the other presentations, if anyone has any questions about that, I'd be happy to answer them to the best of my ability. So just going to the next slide, I just want to confirm that the slides are advancing. Is that the case? Because I can't see.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So the National Register of Historic Places. Well, what is it? So this program, it's a federal program. It was established in 1966 as part of the National Historic Preservation Act. Massachusetts has more than 75,000 properties listed in the National Register. That's the second highest number of any state, second only to Virginia. And many of those properties are listed in districts, and we have about 1,750 districts throughout the state of Massachusetts. A little bit more about the National Historic Preservation Act. This act created a national preservation policy, and it outlined procedures, policies, and goals for preservation in this country. And among other things, it created state historic preservation offices, often referred to by the acronym SHPO. And the Massachusetts Historical Commission, when the act was passed, was designated as the State Historic Preservation Office of Massachusetts. So we were established a couple of years earlier, 1963, but we are the State Historic Preservation Office. Our mission is to identify, evaluate, and protect significant historic and archaeological assets of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It's the office of the State Historic Preservation Officer, as well as the state archaeologist, who currently are the same person, Brana Simon. And the chair of the Massachusetts Historical Commission is the Secretary of the Commonwealth, William Francis Galvin. So jumping right in, the National Register contains a variety of historic resources. It includes downtowns, so they can be rural downtowns, villages. They can be urban downtowns, like the Washington Street Shoe District in Lawrence. Includes rural areas like farms. Farms are cultural landscapes. Elm Hill Farm National Register District in Brookfield is a good example. Residential neighborhoods, including the recently listed Esmond Street Historic District in Boston, as well as industrial areas. Much of the industrial area of Lowell is listed in the National Register. It's also a National Historic Site, including the boot mill, which you see here on the bottom right. Properties span a wide range of time listed in the National Register. So we have a number of what are called first period houses, usually 17th century to very early 18th century, listed in the National Register. Among the oldest in Massachusetts is the James Blake House in Boston. That's listed. And we also have relatively recent buildings in the National Register, including this modernist addition to the Worcester County Courthouse, which dates to 1955. Properties have a variety of ownership. So there are public properties like schools and libraries and town halls. An example here is the Center School in Shirley. And of course, plenty of private properties like private houses, such as this very fine gambrel-roofed cape in Gloucester. Chatham is fairly well represented in the National Register. They have you have several individually listed properties, including the Eldridge Public Library, which you see here on the left. It's probably familiar to all of you. As well as a pretty sizable district, the Old Village Historic District, which I decided to show with a map outlining its boundaries, because I'm sure you're all familiar with downtown Chatham. And in addition to buildings, the National Register includes other types of resources, and that includes sites. Many cemeteries, especially if they don't have buildings or structures within them, are considered sites. An example of a recently listed cemetery that's a site is the Old Settlers Burial Ground in Lancaster, which includes burials dating to the 17th century. Structures, carousels are structures. There are a number of historic carousels in Massachusetts listed in the National Register. And ships are structures, and there are a number of ships that are National Historic Landmarks and or listed in the National Register. A recently listed ship is the Mayflower II, which is a 1950s reconstruction of the Mayflower by a well-known naval historian and architect, William Baker. The National Register includes objects, street clocks, for example, see on the left, milestones. There are many early milestones throughout Massachusetts. Many of them are listed in the National Register. And sculptures, such as this statue by Catherine Lane Weems at Harvard. And finally, districts. So districts can be, obviously, they can be dense urban areas, they can be rural areas. Wendelltown Common is an example of a rural village center that's listed in the National Register. That's in Franklin County in Western Mass. And an example of an urban district is Outing Park Historic District in Springfield. Districts are ensembles. They're usually a mix of buildings, structures, sites, and objects that together tell a story, and they form a cultural landscape. Some properties are listed in a district because they're only eligible in a district. Others are listed individually. So on the left, you have a group of early 20th century apartment buildings in Dorchester, in the Columbia Road Devon Street Historic District. Individually, one of those buildings is probably not eligible for the National Register. They're really best understood collectively in that local context. They share a number of characteristics. They housed people of the same ethnic group early on. They were built by people of the same ethnic group. They were part collectively of speculative development in Dorchester as Boston and its outlying neighborhoods were urbanizing starting at the late 19th century. So individually, one of these buildings doesn't really tell that story, but collectively, they better tell that story. And then on the lower right, example of a building listed individually, there are many I could show. This is an interesting one. This is the Dorsey Jones House in Northampton. This is a mid-19th century house, and it was associated early on in its existence with two escaped enslaved men, both of whom lived there, one after the other. And so this is actually listed as part of an Underground Railroad historic context as well. Some properties are eligible individually. They may be listed individually and also eligible within a district. So the Mission House in Stockbridge, this is actually a National Historic Landmark, which makes it listed in the National Register automatically. So it's individually listed, but it's also a contributing building within the Main Street Historic District in Stockbridge. So how are you eligible for being listed in the National Register? So that process starts with evaluation. That's based on documentation provided in the inventory forms. Inventory forms is kind of baseline preservation planning documentation. When being evaluated, it must be found that whatever is being evaluated, whether it's a building, a structure, a potential district, must meet at least one of the 4 National Register criteria for significance. And they must retain sufficient historic integrity to convey that significance. And that basically means historic character when we talk about historic integrity. So the 4 criteria are A, B, C, and D. Criterion A is broad. It has to do with events and patterns of development. So on the left is a brick schoolhouse, a 19th century schoolhouse in Oakham. That's part of the history of education in Oakham, and that's how it's significant under Criterion A. On the lower right, you have a very fine collection of 3-deckers or triple-deckers in the Providence Street Historic District in Worcester. This was listed about 40 years ago, and these are interesting examples of, now they're interesting buildings, but we're not talking about C in this instance, which has to do with architecture, but in terms of the history of Worcester as it was industrializing, the history of the laborers who lived in these buildings, and that sort of thing. So it's significant not just for the buildings as buildings, but it's important for the associations and the people who lived there, perhaps people who built them as well. Criterion B has to do with significant people, and those can be people of local, state, or national significance. So on the left, you have Emily Dickinson's house in Amherst. That's nationally significant because Emily Dickinson is a nationally significant figure. And on the right, by contrast, we have the house of a hat maker, Ezra Carpenter, in Foxborough. Now, his significance probably didn't extend much beyond the boundary of Foxborough. He was a local artisan, but his house is locally significant to the history of Foxborough because of its association with him. Criterion C has to do with design and construction. It doesn't just have to do with architecture, but it often does. So on the upper left, you have the only Frank Lloyd Wright house in Massachusetts, and that's in Amherst, and that's the Baird House. That's an important property for architecture. On the lower left, you have a locally significant example, a particularly fine and intact Greek Revival house in Harwich, not too far from Chatham. And there are many Greek Revival houses, but within its local context and within Harwich, it's considered one of the better examples, and so it is eligible under Criterion C. And then having to do with engineering, under Criterion C, is a bridge in Lee, which you see on the right here. This is an early lenticular truss bridge. There aren't very many of these left, and this one actually has subsequently been dismantled, but it was listed in the National Register because of its significance in design. Criterion D has to do with information potential, potential to tell stories about the past, and that's generally archaeology. It doesn't have to be, but it generally is archaeology, and that can be prehistoric, pre-European contact, or it can be historic archaeology. So in this example, this is a historic archaeological site in Richmond, in the far western part of Massachusetts, bordering New York. This was the site of a major blast furnace in the 19th century. And most of that's gone, and most of what's left are the foundations, which you can see here. And the idea here is that should this be excavated, it would tell you through what is recovered a great deal about what went on here when it was an active industrial site. As you may imagine, many properties meet more than one criterion. So just staying in Western Mass for a moment, the Fellows Farmstead in Sheffield was listed about 4 years ago, and this is a good example. So under criterion A, it's eligible for agriculture. It's a working farm. It's still more than 100 acres. Under criterion B, it's associated with John Fellows, who built the house. He was a brigadier general in the Massachusetts militia, served in the Revolution, and he served on the Committee of Public Safety in Massachusetts during the Revolution. It's also associated with a later occupant, Elizabeth Ward Greenwood, who was a minister. She was the first woman to preach in the town of Sheffield. And under criterion C, it's listed because it is a very, very intact mid-18th century Georgian house. Nominations for districts often, but they often include components constructed over a wide range of time. That's the case in the proposed Chatham district that we're talking about today. But as an example of one already listed, the Cranesville district in Dalton has a mid-19th century stone mill. It also has a post-World War II vets village of fairly modest capes and other house types that were built for World War II vets and their families after the Second World War. Nominations include resources that are contributing. Those are ones that contribute to the significance of the historic district. And many historic districts also include what are called non-contributing properties. And those are within a National Register district, but they're not considered to contribute to the historic district's significance. And that can be because they are built recently, after what's called the end of the period of significance, or they can be something that's been vastly altered. So here in this Sheffield Plain district, you have a 19th century building on the right of the photograph. That's a contributing property. And on the left, you have a 1970s commercial building. Now, we're getting to the point where the 70s is 50 years ago, and 50 years is generally the threshold for significance if something retains integrity. But when this was listed 30-odd years ago, this building was scarcely 20 years old, and it was considered far too recent to contribute to the history of the historic district. In terms of buildings that are altered, a recently listed district is the Somerset Village Historic District, and there is this house that looked like this when it was documented by the Historic American Building Survey in the 1930s. It was a very fine, circa 1800 house, but now it's been heavily modified, and it really doesn't retain any of its character-defining features except perhaps its form, and so it is a non-contributing building to the historic district. National Register nominations are the documents that support whatever is being nominated, what its significance under the criteria, and it demonstrates that the resources retain sufficient historic character to be able to tell those stories of significance. So that includes the main part of the form, which includes a description. It includes the arguments for significance, why it is eligible, and under which criteria and areas of significance. Districts include data sheets, which document every building, structure, site, and object, dates it, if possible, assigns it contributing, non-contributing status, etc. There are different maps, including a USGS map, assessor's maps, perhaps historic maps, as well as current photographs. And there may be other elements as well, like historic photographs and whatnot. But this is the documentation that collectively goes into a National Register nomination. To be listed in the National Register in a district, properties must be considered significant. They must be contributing, right, to the district. There must be a majority of resources must be significant and contribute. They must retain integrity, but they do not have to be perfectly preserved. And this is a row of buildings in New Bedford. All of them have had some kind of modification since they were built, but collectively they retain that historic character, right? They convey this historic streetscape. And so they are eligible and contributing properties in a historic district. Buildings listed in the National Register do not have to serve their original purpose. So on the upper left is a former 1920s gas station, one of a number of these colonial beacon stations that were built in the suburbs around Boston in the 20s with a gold dome to imitate the State House. Most of them are gone now, including this one. Was demolished about 2 years ago, but for many years this building was an ice cream parlor, right? It was no longer a gas station. On the right is a former train station in Weston, which for many years was a private house. Buildings in the National Register, properties in the National Register do not have to be open to the public, ever. And they don't have to be painted particular colors. So here's an example from Chatham. I don't know if it's still painted those colors, but so we like this photo.
When you have some time, Ben, I'll tell you the story.
Oh, okay. So, there is a common misconception that listing in the National Register means that the, state or federal government is going to review the color you paint your house. That is not true. And, on that theme, all property owners in the district by now should have received our letter, which includes a document called There's a Difference. And that explains the difference between a National Register district and a local historic district. And I won't go into great depth about that, but just to a few points, aside from that fact that there is a big difference between the two types of districts, which can be confusing if you just talk about a historic district. You might not know what people are talking about. Today we're talking about a National Register district. Those are established through the National Park Service ultimately, right? So perhaps it begins at the local level, right? So in Chatham, there was a desire to get this area listed in the National Register. They did some preliminary work. They work with our office, the State Historic Preservation Office, because we manage the National Register program in Massachusetts. And then ultimately, it's something that is reviewed by National Register staff at the National Park Service. And that's a formal recognition that a group of properties is significant. So when they're listed, that's what it is. There is no mandate, right? There's fundamentally, and there's no review of a project within a National Register district unless there is state or federal involvement of some kind, funding, permitting, or licensing, or if there is some kind of local or regional ordinance, bylaw, or policy in effect triggered by National Register listing. A local historic district is a local matter largely. Now, the MHC, my office, can provide some comments when study reports for proposed districts are submitted, but it's really a local matter. It's established however town governance establishes it. So in a town, it's usually through a vote at town meeting. In a city, it might be a city council vote. And this establishes a historic district commission. Sometimes they have a different name, but that's effectively what it is. And they have design review authority over proposed modifications. If it's for a building, it's basically architectural features or features visible from a public way, and that can include demolition, new construction, and that sort of thing. So it's a very different purpose and it's a different process from the National Register. So what are some of the benefits of listing in the National Register? Well, there are quite a number. Many individual, property owners who individually list their house, but as well as, towns that would like a district listed, are looking for community pride and honor, right? There's also an education opportunity. There's heritage tourism. There is eligibility for funding assistance for properties owned by municipalities and nonprofits, including our Massachusetts Historical Commission grant program called the Massachusetts Preservation Project Fund. CPA funding, if you have the Community Preservation Act passed, can be enhanced by listing, and planning. So fundamentally, the National Register is a planning tool, but it has many other benefits as well. So honor, so once a district or a property is listed, people often put up signs. They may put up on their house. The municipality may put up signs to alert you when you come in to the historic district by road. Districts, all properties have certificates produced, identifying them as, and as being listed in the National Register. For districts, those certificates go to the local historical commission, and all property owners receive a postcard. Any property owners who would like a certificate can request one from our office. As an education tool, now these are public documents, so anyone can use them for whatever purpose they'd like. There have been teaching programs established with some National Register nominations. Some communities in Massachusetts have done walking tours. So Lowell has done a lot of them for their neighborhoods, but even other places like Chesterfield in Western Mass have done walking tours based on National Register documents. As I said, opportunities for funding. So these are some photographs of in progress. I think these are both done now, but these are ones that show these signs that they are the recipient of Massachusetts Preservation Project funds. That's a matching grant funding program administered by our office annually. And as I said, it's for municipalities and nonprofits for properties listed in the state register. And so being listed in the national register is a way to be listed in the state register and thus eligible for those grants. There's also an opportunity for income-producing properties, generally privately owned, for what's by shorthand called the historic tax credit or the rehabilitation investment tax credit. So there's a state tax credit and there's a federal tax credit in Massachusetts. So the federal one has existed for 45 odd years. The state tax credit a little less, but this is for income-producing properties that are subject to what are called certified rehabilitations, substantial rehabilitation. So here you see the Chelsea Post Office, which passed into private ownership and was rehabilitated for an income-producing purpose, and now looks like it does on the right. And this is really the most effective preservation tool in the United States. The tax credit, it saves uncountable thousands of buildings from being demolished and makes many. The purpose of it is to make rehabilitation projects that might otherwise not be financially viable into something that can be done, so you don't lose a historic resource that could have an income-producing purpose. As a planning tool, it's very useful. So on the upper left, you see Northampton State Hospital. So 30-odd years ago, the state hospitals in Massachusetts were closed. People didn't really know what was going to happen to them. There were these sprawling campuses with historic buildings, and many of them were documented and listed in the National Register as part of a planning process to perhaps figure out what to do with them. The Northampton State Hospital was ultimately demolished, but it was listed in the National Register before that. Falmouth Village Green, so a state road runs through Falmouth Village, and there was a plan to widen that road. And because it was listed in the National Register, the community had a seat at the planning table. And they were part of the review process of this road widening scheme, and they ultimately were able to do some negotiating, and it didn't impact the historic center of Falmouth Village as negatively as it could have. And in the Rockland Public Library, which is listed, there is now an addition, and there was a proposed addition, and because it's listed in the National Register, a decision was made to make this addition more in keeping with the historic design and more deferential to it than might otherwise have been the case. So all properties listed in the National Register ultimately are, the nominations are put in our public database, which is called MACRIS, the Massachusetts Cultural Resource Information System. This is the homepage of the new MACRIS, which launched less than a year ago. And so anyone, again, they're public documents, anyone can navigate there, download the nomination form once it's listed, read it, and there's other things as well. There's inventory forms, there's all kinds of information there. And we also have a mapping platform, GIS mapping platform. So you can also find things that way by navigating over the map. And ultimately, as I said briefly earlier, this is a kind of a joint process, and it involves the local community, it involves the MHC as well, and ultimately it does also involve the Park Service. But it's a joint effort. So it's collaborative, it's a joint effort, and thank you all for having me today. And if you would like more information, here's our website and phone number and address. But I will be happy to take your questions later if you have any. So, thanks.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Let me just
Hopefully,
stop sharing.
Hopefully you got a good overview, but just to remind people here, there is a pamphlet in the back of the room. You can pick it up about the difference between an historic district, National Register district, which is quite informational, so make sure you get it before you leave. Next on the agenda is Eric Dre. As I said, he's our preservation consultant to the Historical Commission, and Eric has been with us for a number of years, and we appreciate his efforts. And I know how much work you put into this, Eric, so you're on, kid.
Are you guys going to be able to see
Okay,
the
great. Thank you very
screen
much.
for me? Okay, good. Yeah. So South Chatham Village has long been recognized as a distinct place in Chatham. In 1862, the village was formally named South Chatham when the branch post office was opened. And as you can see, this is a, oh, sorry. This is the 1880 Barnstable County Atlas. They did a town-by-town atlas, and they decided which sub-areas in each town were distinct enough to warrant their own map. And starting in 1880, South Chatham Village was one of those places. And just, I'm sure you can orient yourself, but that's Meeting House Road and Pleasant and Forest Beach, and there's the cemetery, which forms the western boundary. And what you may not know is that originally the church for which that cemetery was intended was north of there, across the Harwich line, the Bethel Church, which is no longer extant. South Chatham Village has also long been recognized as a place worthy of documentation by historic preservationists and historians. The district the area was documented in what's called an area form. There are building forms for each building, and then there are area forms for places that are a collection of buildings. And the area form was done here back in 1991. And at that time, the surveyor, as part of the job of doing an area form as a consultant, you also determine in your professional opinion whether this area might be eligible for the National Register. And then you include an eligibility opinion. And that was included back in 1991. In 2017, Chatham Historical Commission was interested in updating their documentation in the town, including redoing the area form for South Chatham to current standards, which is one of the things that I did. And I found, not surprisingly, that the village really had retained tremendous integrity between 1991 and 2017, and was still, in my opinion, at least eligible for the National Register. Because of the interest in pursuing further the National Register process, the next step in that is to see if the State Historic Preservation Office, which Ben talked about, which is also Mass Historical Commission, and I'll say MHC moving forward. So MHC is responsible for administering the National Register program. You can't really proceed with a nomination until the staff at MHC concur that this district is indeed eligible. And so we requested that they conduct their bi-monthly staff, at one of their bi-monthly staff meetings on this to weigh in on the South Chatham Village. And they did, in fact, concur that it is eligible. They found it eligible. You heard Ben talk about the different criteria. They found it eligible under criterion A, which is history, and under criterion C, which is architecture, and found it to be significant at the local level. Under criterion A, history, South Chatham was deemed significant at the local level under two contexts. The first was under the context of maritime history. Main Street was laid out in the 17th century as the Harwich Road, and this remote area in Chatham began to attract a small number of settlers in the mid-18th century. The house at the far right is the Phillips House, 2446 Main Street, set back at a slight angle from the street, which dates to circa 1740 and is one of the two oldest houses in the district. And one sort of sidebar about dating houses on Cape Cod, we have a particular challenge because the Registry of Deeds burned in 1827 and all registry records were lost. And they managed to recreate some, but a small percentage. So we use circa a lot on anything that goes back before that because it becomes very difficult. So I love this aerial photo. It actually dates to circa 1940, but it shows the connection of South Chatham Village to Nantucket Sound. And those two route roads have long been used to get down to do maritime activity along the shoreline. And as the fishing industry and coasting trade expanded in the mid-19th century, there was a shift in new settlement activity along Nantucket Sound. And this included South Chatham. This portion of Nantucket Sound was the first to be commercially exploited in Chatham using fish weirs and related businesses of salt making and fish drying. The success of these enterprises was important to the growth of South Chatham, with some of South Chatham's residents becoming civic and financial leaders of the town. As a result of that maritime success, by the mid-19th century, the number of buildings in South Chatham had increased significantly, with a dense pattern along Main Street, as well as portions of Pleasant Street and Forest Beach Road. As census records attest, from that period, a great majority of South Chatham's working men were connected to the sea. And many of the contributing resources within the district were built by or associated with South Chatham families who worked in the maritime industry. A small number of families owned large landholdings in and around South Chatham Village. Prominent names included Baker, Bierce, and Nickerson, but by far the most prevalent name, as you'll see in slides moving forward, was the Eldridge family. So maritime history is one of the stories that the buildings in the South Chatham Village tells that is deemed significant. The second is what National Park Service refers to as entertainment and recreation. And what that means here is that South Chatham Village was deemed eligible because of the emergence of the seasonal and tourism economies following the decline of the fishing industry and how it manifested in South Chatham Village. Following the Civil War, fishing declined throughout Cape Cod, due in part to overfishing. Between 1860 and 1890, Cape Cod lost a third of its population. Many young families moved to urban areas for new industrial jobs. The decline of maritime activity, however, was followed by a transition from maritime to, as I said, the seasonal resort economy. This was enhanced in Chatham by the arrival of the Chatham Branch Railroad, which opened in 1887, extending a spur of the Harwich Line into Chatham Center. And this included a depot in South Chatham, which you can see in the upper left, which is no longer extant. So some of the changes that happened with the emergence of this new economy was the construction of more modest houses, including bungalows and traditional capes. And so an example in the upper right rather, you can see that bungalow was kind of added in between some of the older 19th century houses. And additional resources were built to support the evolving nature of the village, including a village hall and the first Bethel Church, we can see on the lower left. This transition to a resort economy and local population growth continued into the mid-20th century, spurred by the advent of the automobile and improved roadways. Modest cottages, some for seasonal use, continued to be built. In addition, a few dwellings along Main Street were adaptively reused for restaurants, shops, or inns. A prominent example of a residential conversion for a hotel is the former Harding House at 2681 Main Street in the upper left that was built in 1850. Following World War II, the property came into the ownership of Adam and Ethel Schweitzer of Ridgefield, New Jersey. It's unclear if the property had already been in use as an inn when they bought it, but it was the Schweitzers who built the two motel buildings behind the main house in 1950. And those two buildings are an example of how more recent buildings can contribute to the story and to the history of the village. So those two modest little motel buildings behind it are contributing as well as the original house. Another example is a Levi Eldridge Jr. house at 2597 Main Street. Eldridge Jr. was one of South Chatham's most prominent citizens. In 1950, his great-grandson, Cyrus Baker, bought the property from other family members and converted it into a hardware store. So we talked about Criterion A history as one of the areas of significance for South Chatham Village. The other is Criterion C, which commonly is referred to as being about architecture. And the South Chatham Village was deemed significant because it exhibits many historical architectural styles prevalent during the period of significance from the early 18th century into the mid-20th century. South Chatham Village includes a large number of Cape Cod cottages, including two full capes, 3 three-quarter capes, and 7 half capes. And actually, the 7 half capes represent 1/3 of all the half capes in Chatham built up until the early 20th century. And one of the oldest, as I mentioned earlier, one of the oldest extant dwellings is the 3/4 cape at 2446 Main Street. And then across from Pleasant Street, as I'm sure you recognize, are those 3 half capes all in a row that are partially obscured, but are still can be seen. The greatest concentration of contributing resources and houses in the district were built in the 19th century. This includes the one federal-style two-story side gable house, which you can see in the upper left, which dates to circa 1780. And there are 22 examples of Greek Revival-style houses. And the character-defining feature you'll find for Greek Revival-style houses is that the front, gable front elevation is intended to evoke the idea of a temple. So you have pilasters on the corners instead of columns. You have the pediment. Sometimes it's enclosed, sometimes it's open. And one of the most elegant examples is 2647 Main Street. It's interesting because that's the one house that was not built in South Chatham. It was actually built in Nantucket and floated over. So maybe it reflects a little more refined, a sensibility for that architectural style in Nantucket. And it's the only one with that beautiful recessed entrance with the columns. Later styles in the 19th century are also well represented in the district. There are 3 examples of Gothic Revival style houses, and the one in the upper left is the example that's included here. And the character-defining feature that you kind of most easily will identify them, at least in South Chatham, is that centered wall, dormer, or gable that's more steeply pitched. It's Gothic Revival style like to emphasize verticality. And so those gable fronts just got steeper. And so that's how you know it's Gothic Revival. There are also 7 examples of the Italianate style, and the upper right and lower left are examples of that. And the most easy way to identify an Italianate style house is if you see those paired brackets. So in a lot of ways, it's similar to a Greek Revival in that temple form, but it starts to be ornamented a little more Victorian-inspired decoration with the paired brackets. And then on the lower right is an example of the Queen Anne style house. The Queen Anne style was a reaction against the sort of formality of Greek Revival style architecture. So they started to use different roof forms and different materials to enliven the elevations and the overall picturesque quality of the building. Contributing resources in the district also include bungalows. My favorite is 54 Forest Beach Road. I just think it's a fantastic example of a bungalow. But there are a number of good examples in the district, and there are also some more modest cottages and capes. But what's also really unusual for South Chatham, and I don't know if you've ever even seen it, but you have what is, in my opinion, I've done a lot of research with mid-century modern houses. I think the best mid-century modern house in the Central Cape. It's an extraordinary architect design house. It was designed by the son for his parents, and it is completely intact and just a remarkable house. So the district is predominantly residential, but one of the crowning jewels of the district, in my opinion, is the Eldridge General Store at 2607 Main Street. It's because it's the way it's located, it's sort of a little bend in the road. It's highly visible from both directions, and it's just, to me, kind of the iconic symbol of South Chatham Village. And it was built in circa 1839, and is actually the oldest surviving purpose-built commercial building in Chatham, throughout Chatham. Contributing buildings don't just include, houses and stores, but also outbuildings. And so on the bottom are 2 examples of barns that are considered contributing. Both have been converted to residential use, but are still very legible as the barns they originally were. And in the bottom right, you can see that barn has that telltale centered, steeper gable to indicate the Gothic Revival style. There are 6 civic or institutional buildings in the district, all contributing and all located along Main Street. This includes the 1905 Queen Anne style former South Chatham School, the 1917 Gothic Revival South Chatham Community Church, and on that same parcel is the 1934 Colonial Revival style South Chatham Public Library. That is one of 3 colonial revival style institutional buildings in South Chatham Village, and they're the only colonial revival style institutional buildings in Chatham throughout. And Ben had mentioned sites, and there is one site which I referenced, which is the Bethel Cemetery, which forms part of the western boundary, that has the earliest death date of 1834. So lastly, I just wanted to talk about the nomination itself. The most important is what the boundary of the district should be. And so I wanted to start again with that 1880 map of South Chatham Village. And then I found this amazing circa 1940 aerial photograph, which shows that exact, you can read that exact boundary from that 1880 map. It's still there. And there had been very little infill development, obviously, around the perimeter of it yet. But that has formed, that guided our decision on what the boundary for the district should be. So the east and south boundaries, the east boundary and the south boundaries on Pleasant Street and Forest Beach Road were marked by the abrupt sort of stop of historic houses and or the construction of modern houses. And the west boundary is demarcated by Bethel Cemetery and the last historic house on the north side of Main Street. And Mass Historical Commission and the National Park Service don't like to have districts with donuts or holes in them. And so they like to have districts run down both sides of a street if possible. So that's how you end up with some resources that are not contributing but are still included within the boundary, and also sometimes some vacant parcels as well. So this page shows the summary count. There's 117 contributing buildings in the district. 5 were built pre-1800, 55 in the 1800s, 26 up to 1945, and 19 between 1945 and 1971, which was, and Ben had mentioned that 50 years is the cutoff by which MHC and National Park Service starts to consider significance. So that typically is the cutoff date for a district. And we started this in 2021, so 1971 has been the date. And there are a total of 13 non-contributing properties in the district. So there are 2 most important parts of this are the architectural description, where I went into great detail describing many of the contributing resources within the district. And this is where, and then the second part is the historic significance. And as you can see, it's checked A under history is checked, and C under architecture is checked. And we list that the context, which is maritime history, entertainment and recreation, and architecture, and the period of significance, which goes from 1735 until 1971. And again, I go into, those contexts and those stories are greatly detailed in section 8 of the nomination. There's a bibliography list of the 33 photographs that are included with the nomination, and a series of figures, historic images and maps that were of some importance to tell the story. And I like the one down below. Does anyone recognize the bottom building? What it is now? It's Pisces. Yeah.
What is it? Oh, Pisces.
Yeah.
Oh.
So. And I think Ben had mentioned that one of the other components is a district data sheet. This is how you come up with that count for how many resources there are. And this is one of the pages out of that. And it includes the date, the historic name if there is one, the architectural style if there is one, and the type of resource it is. In this case, they're all buildings. And then next to it is identification of whether it's contributing or non-contributing. And that's just useful to know, for future planning, because things like garages, for example, typically were not built 50 or more years ago and are identified in the data sheet, but with an NC after them saying non-contributing. Actually, there's an example down below at 260 Main Street. There's a garage built circa 1980 that's non-contributing. And so I leave you with this, another version of the district boundary map, which also shows the overlay of the historic business district. And Sarah Korjeff is going to talk a little bit about that and other regulatory concerns.
Thank you, Eric. Just want to remind the members of the public and here that the actual application is available. It's about 70 or 80 pages, so it's thick. And it's available in the Eldridge Public Library if you'd like to peruse it. And eventually, assuming we're going to be positive and get the National Register designation, we'll probably make copies available to some members of the public. Sarah Korjeff?
All right, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So my name is Sarah Korjeff. I'm a planner and preservation specialist with the Cape Cod Commission, and I'm here to talk to you about protections that are granted to historic preservation, to National Register properties under the Cape Cod Commission Act. So if you're not familiar with the Cape Cod Commission, we're the regional planning and regulatory agency that covers the 15 towns of Cape Cod. And our purposes really range broadly from environmental protections to economic development and housing provision. But today, I'm specifically going to focus on our purpose to protect significant historic, cultural, and archaeological resources on Cape Cod. So with that as one of our primary goals, the Cape Cod Commission Act provides limited protection against demolition of National Register properties or major changes to National Register properties if no local historic districts exist to protect them. So as part of that process, the Chatham Historical Commission reviews exterior alterations or demolition proposals and decides whether it's warranted, there's enough change or enough concern about the amount of change or demolition that it would have to be reviewed by the Cape Cod Commission. Specifically, this is meant to be a way of protecting National Register properties, the character of our important historic areas, and preventing full-scale demolition or major demolitions to these significant properties. So specifically, the Chatham Historical Commission could request review by the Cape Cod Commission if a full-scale demolition is proposed, or if major demolition, major parts of the building, including its most significant sort of character-defining architectural features, if those are proposed for demolition, with the idea that removing enough of the architectural detailing that it might threaten the building's eligibility for listing on the National Register anymore. In most cases, the Historical Commission works cooperatively with the property owner to sort of guide them towards understanding what are those significant historic features on their building, and helps them identify a design that can accommodate their needs but still preserve those key features of the building. And in doing that, avoids the potential for any review by the Cape Cod Commission. And I want to just point out, when Ben Haley was making his presentation, he showed the outlines of the Old Village National Register Historic District. That's a district that Chatham's had in place since 2001. It includes about over 200 properties. So there have been a number of projects or proposed changes to the buildings within that historic district. But in over 20 years, only 3 of those properties have actually been reviewed by the Cape Cod Commission. Those were all full-scale demolition or major demolition proposals, because all of the other proposals were additions to a building or modest alterations that didn't completely destroy the historic significant portions of the structure. So just to be a little more specific about those properties where this would even come into play, this is another version of the map that Eric showed with an overlay. You can see the red outline of the National Register proposed district. And then in kind of a pale pink color, it shows the existing historic business district in Chatham. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the protections for National Register properties that are offered under the Cape Cod Commission Act only apply if there isn't already a local historic district or another local protection for historic properties. So here, any property that's within the historic business district in Chatham would continue to be reviewed by the Historic Business District Commission, and the National Register designation wouldn't have any impact on that. It's only, the protections offered under the Cape Cod Commission Act only apply to properties that are outside the Historic Business District. They also only apply to contributing properties, so to those with historic significance that contribute to the story that's being told in this National Register district. And I also want to, because there are so many single-family homes in this proposed district, I also want to mention that the Cape Cod Commission Act has an exemption from review for single-family homes unless there's a change to at least 25% of the gross floor area. So modest scale alterations or proposals would never be reviewed by the Cape Cod Commission, and it would only, again, we'd be focusing on full-scale demolition or demolition of the vast majority of the building. In those few cases where we have reviewed a project, and I should say that Chatham's not the only town on Cape Cod, obviously, that has National Register historic districts. There are a number throughout our towns, and I would say we review maybe one a year, often from the towns with the largest number of properties on the National Register, like Barnstable and Yarmouth. But when review occurs, the proposal is measured against recognized historic preservation standards, which we have identified in our regional planning documents and technical bulletins, and specifically focusing on a few key elements like renovating, reusing, and incorporating a historic building into whatever the new proposal is. We think about how traditionally historic structures have been added to over time, and that's part of what makes them interesting and tell sort of a complete story of the evolution of the community. We want to see that tradition continue. New additions can certainly be accommodated. Alterations to buildings can be accommodated. We just want to see them supplementing the historic structure rather than replacing them. Also, renovating and incorporating historic structures into a new design. So we're keeping the historic structure, but also designing any new changes so that they don't destroy the historically significant features of the building. So if the historic facade is really defines the architectural style and includes most of the detailing, that front facade of the building would be where we would not want to see change and would prefer to see additions to the rear and to secondary facades following sort of local traditions of building evolution over time. And with that, that's the end of my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer questions along with the rest of the folks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Should
I think I'm
close
going to
this
make
out?
copies of this and hand it out to my members of the commission, so before we call you. It's very, 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 very useful. Well, at this particular point, I'd like to ask if there are any members of the audience or anybody online has any specific questions for either Sarah, Eric, or Ben, who's still here. I guess that's a good sign that we, oh, yes. Could you come up to the podium and introduce yourself? Thank you very much, sir.
Thanks, everybody. Niles Draper, 2214 Pleasant Street. Just curious, out of the 75,000 houses that are in the register...
Could you speak into the mic a little
sorry.
closer?
Out of all the houses that are in the register and the size of the program, how much money is given out for remodeling or, benefit into this program? I guess over the years, how many people apply, and then how much money has actually gone out to the renovation or restoration of these buildings? Thank you.
Thank you.
So I can try to answer that, but so for private property owners for their own houses, there aren't, unless there's a municipal grant pool, there's no funding for private property owners to fix their own houses. Institutional, nonprofit, municipal buildings that are listed in the state register, and that can be through the National Register, can be eligible, can qualify for Massachusetts Preservation Project Fund grants. There are other grant programs as well, but that's our grant program. And then the Rehabilitation Investment Tax Credit, or the Historic Tax Credit, which is for income-producing properties, generally speaking, not owned by nonprofits, unless there's some kind of structure there with a private developer or something that, you know, allows someone to take the credit, or the nonprofit sells the state credit, which is kind of complicated to explain right now. I don't know the statistics for that, but it's millions of dollars, many millions of dollars. I think it's per year. It's going to. There's a proposal to raise it, but it's implemented every 5 years by the legislature. It's been reapproved every 5 years. So there's millions of dollars in tax credits that are allocated for these income producing property projects.
All right, I think I'm giving away my motivation here, but is rental income considered income?
It is, yes.
It's a good
Rental
question.
income is income. Yep, it is. I couldn't answer specific questions, but we do have several people on our tax credit staff who could certainly, if you called, you could certainly talk to them about a proposed project. So yes, rental properties that are listed in the National Register are conceivably eligible for the Rehabilitation Investment Tax Credit.
Good question. Sorry.
Which we should say is a 20% tax credit. It's a very significant.
Can you please come to the microphone? We can't hear you.
I just want to say that investment tax credit is a 20% tax credit, so it's a very significant amount of money that has made, as Ben has said, an enormous impact throughout the country.
So it's 20% state, and there's also a 20% federal.
Yeah, and again, it's not a deduction; it's a credit.
It's a tax credit.
Yeah.
Tax credit. I'm sorry, sir. There's actually one property in Chatham which is going under applying for a federal tax credit, and that's the Monomoy Theater property, which will be a commercial theater, and he is applying for the federal. I think he also was going to apply for the state, but he was having some problems with Mass Historic. That's a joke, Ben. So, but he may apply for both federal and state. Yes, Sarah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add briefly that in the past, it was typical that it was large projects that primarily qualified for the tax credit incentives, and yet in more recent years, I've seen smaller projects take advantage of them, including here on Cape Cod, and I can think of one recent example in the town of Barnstable within a National Register historic district, and it is an income-producing property as a rental property that's taking advantage of the credits.
Yeah, it's an interesting program, and I try to encourage people to do it. In addition to private, it's also because we have a member of the town staff here. Any municipal buildings or nonprofits can also apply. So there's a number of things that we could potentially do. And it's interesting. Our potential National Register district is a little bit different than the Old Village, where the Old Village really doesn't have any significant commercial properties, but the South Chatham the district does have commercial properties, including a number of rentals. Thank you. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. I'd like to close and just briefly acknowledge something, and it was interesting when Ben had made his presentation, and then also Eric, relative to the whole concept of a National Register district and the fact that in 1991, I guess Chatham filled out its first area form and said that South Chatham Village was eligible. And I guess that 30 years ago? Okay, 30 years. And here we are, 2022. The South Chatham Village Association, which I want to acknowledge, Carol Gordon, the president of the South Chatham Village, happens to be in our audience. And it's really with their help and leadership, for the last 8 or 9 years, I guess, that with Eric's help, that we were able to dust off the old applications, update the macros and the Form Bs, and here we are. I'd like to hopefully think we're on the 5-yard line, Ben. And the process here continues relative to comments from residents in the district. And when that's complete, I think it's June 8th is the date? June 8th, a presentation.
Yeah, the State Review Board meeting is June 8th.
Right, and then there's a presentation by Eric to the State Review Board, and after the State Review Board, what's the next step after that, Ben?
So I don't foresee any issues with this nomination being accepted by the State Review Board. So they would vote, so there'll be a presentation, they'll vote on it. After that, it gets a final edit. and then it's submitted to the National Park Service for their review. Their review generally is 45 days. I mean, by the regs, but they generally take the entire amount of time. It's generally 45 days from the receipt and acknowledgement in the Federal Register. So it'll appear in the Federal Register on the pending list of National Register nominations. And so you can expect it to be, not that long after it appears on the pending list. It should be listed unless the reviewer has any issues. If the reviewer has issues, that doesn't mean the nomination is rejected. It just means that she will return it to our office for edits and on whatever the issue is. So, you can expect it to be listed within a few months of the June 8th meeting.
Thank you very much. So I guess the 5-yard line is a good analogy. We're almost there. Well, again, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the town of Chatham and all the cooperation we've gotten over the years with Ms. Donovan, Katie Donovan, the Director of Community Development, who has helped us move things along. So having said that, unless there's any other further questions, I'd like to adjourn. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate everybody coming. Thank you.